The world just heard the word ceasefire, but behind that word, something far more dangerous is quietly unfolding. Because while headlines say tensions are cooling, the reality on the ground tells a completely different story. The United States has extended its ceasefire with Iran indefinitely, no deadline, no clear agreement from Tehran, no confirmed acceptance from all sides. And yet, at the very same moment, U.S. naval forces are tightening their grip around Iran's coastline. Warships are not pulling back. Shipping routes are not reopening. Pressure is not easing, it's increasing. So the question isn't whether the conflict is slowing down. The real question is, why does a ceasefire look more like the beginning of a new phase of confrontation? Because if this is peace, it doesn't look like peace at all. Right now, the situation between the United States and Iran sits in a strange and unstable position, somewhere between open conflict and controlled tension. On April 22nd, a major announcement came from Washington. President Donald Trump declared that the ceasefire would be extended indefinitely, reportedly after mediation efforts involving Pakistan. On the surface, it sounded like a step toward stability, a pause to allow diplomacy to work. But within hours, a different reality became clear. The U.S. Navy would continue its blockade of Iranian ports, not reduce it, not ease it, continue it. And that changes everything because in modern warfare, a blockade is not a neutral move. It is pressure, it is control, and in many cases, it is considered an act of war. Iranian officials wasted no time responding. From Tehran's perspective, this is not a ceasefire. It's a strategic squeeze. Their message has been consistent. You cannot claim peace while restricting a nation's ability to trade, import, export, and operate freely at sea. So what we're witnessing right now is not a clean pause in conflict. It's a layered standoff where diplomacy and military pressure are happening at the same time, and that combination is extremely volatile because history shows that ceasefires don't collapse when both sides are disengaging. They collapse when one side feels cornered. To understand why this moment matters, you have to look beyond the headlines and into the mechanics of what's actually happening in the region. The Persian Gulf, one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth, has become the center of this tension. This isn't just about Iran and the United States. This is about global trade, energy supply, and geopolitical influence. A significant portion of the world's oil flows through these waters. And when military forces begin controlling access to that flow, the impact is not regional, it's global. In recent days, shipping activity near the Strait of Hormuz has already shown signs of disruption. Fewer vessels, higher insurance risks, increased uncertainty among global markets. All of this is happening despite the so-called ceasefire, which raises another critical question. Is the ceasefire actually meant to stop conflict or to reposition it? Because from a strategic standpoint, extending a ceasefire while maintaining a blockade gives one side a major advantage. It allows continued pressure without the political cost of active bombing. It creates leverage, and leverage is everything in negotiations like this. But leverage cuts both ways because Iran is not a passive actor in this situation. It has its own tools, its own alliances, and its own ways of responding. And perhaps most importantly, it has made it clear that it does not negotiate under pressure. That single factor could determine whether this fragile pause holds or breaks. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels are active, talks are being explored, messages are being exchanged, but the tone is cautious, the trust is low, and the gap between positions remains wide. For Washington, the goal appears to be maintaining pressure while pushing Iran toward concessions. For Tehran, the priority is resisting that pressure without triggering a full scale confrontation. And in between those two strategies lies a very narrow path, a path where one miscalculation, one incident at sea, one misunderstood signal could change everything overnight because this is not a frozen conflict. It is a moving situation, dynamic, unpredictable, and highly sensitive. And the signs suggest that what we're seeing now is not the end of escalation, but a shift in how that escalation is being carried out. There's another layer to this story that often goes unnoticed: the involvement of mediators. Countries like Pakistan are stepping in, trying to create space for dialogue, trying to prevent the situation from tipping over the edge. But mediation in a conflict like this is incredibly complex because it's not just about bringing two sides to the table, it's about managing trust, timing, and perception. And right now, perception is everything. If Iran believes the ceasefire is being used as a cover for continued pressure, its willingness to engage will shrink. If the United States believes pressure is the only way to force movement, it will continue tightening its strategy. And that creates a cycle where both sides feel justified and neither side backs down. This is why the current moment is so critical, because it's not just about what is happening today, it's about what this setup leads to next. A ceasefire that reduces tension can open the door to peace, but a ceasefire that maintains pressure can quietly build towards something much bigger. And that's exactly what analysts around the world are watching right now. Not just the headlines, but the contradictions within them. Because when actions don't match words, it usually means something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something strategic, something calculated, something that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And as this situation continues to unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This is not a simple pause in conflict, it is a moment of transition, a moment where the direction of the entire crisis could change, depending on what happens next. If you look closely at the current situation, the ceasefire is not the real story. The real story is control, control of movement, control of pressure, control of timing. And at the center of that strategy is the U.S. naval presence, a network of warships, surveillance systems, and enforcement operations that has quietly become one of the most powerful tools in this conflict. Because unlike airstrikes or missile attacks, a naval blockade operates in a gray zone. It doesn't always make headlines, it doesn't always look like war, but its impact can be just as devastating. By restricting access to ports and monitoring maritime traffic, the United States is effectively shaping Iran's economic lifeline without firing a single shot. And that's exactly what makes this strategy so dangerous, because it allows pressure to continue while maintaining the appearance of restraint. From Washington's perspective, this approach creates leverage. It keeps Iran contained. It signals strength, and it sends a message to allies and adversaries alike. The United States is still firmly in control of the region, but beneath that strategy lies a deeper calculation, because this is not just about Iran, it's about the broader balance of power in the Middle East. The U.S. is not operating in isolation here. Its actions are closely watched by regional allies, particularly Israel, which has its own security concerns and strategic interests tied to Iran's capabilities. At the same time, global powers like China and Russia are observing every move, assessing how far the United States is willing to go and where opportunities might emerge. Because in a conflict like this, every action sends multiple signals. A blockade is not just a military maneuver, it's a geopolitical statement. It tells the world who controls key trade routes, it influences energy markets, and it reshapes alliances in subtle but powerful ways. But Iran understands this game just as well. Tehran has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of pressure, and instead of responding directly, it often chooses indirect strategies. This is where things become more complex and more unpredictable. Iran's strength doesn't rely solely on conventional military power, it relies on networks, regional influence, proxy groups, strategic positioning across multiple fronts. This means that pressure in one area can trigger responses in another, and that's already beginning to happen. While the focus remains on the naval blockade, tensions are quietly rising in other parts of the region. Signals are emerging that suggest Iran is not simply absorbing the pressure, it's adjusting to it and possibly preparing its own response. This is the hidden layer of the conflict, the part that doesn't always appear in official statements, the part where strategies are tested, limits are explored, and red lines are slowly pushed. Because in modern geopolitical conflicts, escalation rarely happens in a straight line. It happens in waves, small moves, measured responses, gradual shifts that build toward larger consequences. And right now, both sides are carefully navigating those waves. The United States is applying pressure without crossing into full scale conflict. Iran is resisting without triggering direct confrontation. But that balance is incredibly fragile because it depends on both sides interpreting each other's actions correctly. And that is where the real danger lies. Misinterpretation, a warning signal mistaken for aggression, a defensive move seen as escalation, a calculated action triggering an unintended response. In a highly tense environment like this, even minor incidents can spiral, and there have already been signs of that risk. The recent seizure of an Iranian linked vessel by U.S. forces is a perfect example. From Washington's perspective, it was a controlled enforcement action based on suspicions of dual use cargo. From Tehran's perspective, it was a violation, a direct challenge, a provocation, two completely different interpretations of the same event. And that's exactly how escalation begins, not always through intention, but through perception. Because once trust is gone, every action is viewed through a lens of suspicion. And right now, trust between the United States and Iran is almost non existent. That makes every decision more dangerous, every move more significant, every delay more uncertain. There's also a timing factor that cannot be ignored. The decision to extend the ceasefire indefinitely without a clear framework creates ambiguity, and ambiguity can be a double edged sword. On one hand, it gives negotiators flexibility. It allows room for quiet diplomacy, back channel discussions, and gradual progress. But on the other hand, it creates uncertainty on the ground. Military commanders operate without clear endpoints. Allies question the long term strategy. Markets react to mixed signals. And in that environment, stability becomes harder to maintain because everyone is trying to read between the lines, trying to understand what comes next, trying to predict whether this is the beginning of de escalation or simply a pause before something much bigger. Another critical factor is the economic dimension of the blockade. And this is not just about military positioning, it's about pressure on Iran's economy. By limiting maritime activity, the United States is indirectly affecting trade, revenue, and financial stability. And economic pressure has a long history in conflicts like this. It's often used to push a country toward negotiation, but it can also have the opposite effect. It can harden positions, increase resistance, and create internal pressure that leads to unpredictable outcomes because when a nation feels economically cornered, its response is not always diplomatic. Sometimes it becomes more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more willing to challenge the status quo. And that is a scenario that cannot be ignored here, especially when combined with the military tension already present in the region. So, what we're seeing is not just a ceasefire, it's a layered strategy. Military pressure, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, all operating at the same time and all influencing each other. This is why the current situation is so difficult to predict, because it's not driven by a single factor. It's driven by a complex interaction of strategies, perceptions, and decisions. And at any moment, one of those elements could shift. One decision, one misstep, one unexpected move, and the entire balance could change. Because in a conflict like this, stability is not defined by peace, it's defined by control. And right now, both sides are trying to maintain that control without losing it completely. The most dangerous phase of any conflict is not always when missiles are flying. It's the moment just before that. The moment when pressure builds, signals intensify, and both sides are still holding back, but only just. That's exactly where this situation is heading now. Because the current balance, this uneasy mix of ceasefire and blockade, cannot hold forever. At some point, it will shift. And when it does, it won't be gradual. It will be sudden. Right now, there are several paths this crisis could take, and none of them are simple. The first possibility is the most obvious, but also the most unpredictable: a naval confrontation. The waters around the Strait of Hormuz are already under extreme tension. U.S. forces are enforcing restrictions. Iranian vessels are operating under pressure. Commercial ships are navigating through uncertainty. All it takes is one moment, one vessel refusing to comply, one warning misheard, one maneuver misinterpreted, and suddenly a controlled situation becomes a direct clash. Because at sea, decisions happen fast. There's no time for long diplomatic exchanges. There's only reaction, and reaction under stress can be explosive. If a confrontation happens, even a limited one, it could instantly shatter the fragile ceasefire, not because either side planned it, but because neither side can afford to appear weak. And that leads to escalation. The second scenario is more subtle, but just as dangerous: economic escalation. The blockade is already putting pressure on Iran's ability to operate freely in international trade. If that pressure increases, tighter inspections, more seizures, greater restrictions, Iran may respond in a different way, not with direct military force, but by targeting the system itself. Cyber operations, indirect disruption of shipping, pressure through regional allies. These are tools that don't trigger immediate retaliation, but slowly raise the stakes. And over time, they can create the same level of instability as open conflict. Because global markets don't need missiles to panic, they react to uncertainty, and uncertainty is already growing. Oil prices have shown sensitivity to even minor developments. Shipping routes are becoming riskier, insurance costs are rising, all signs that the world is quietly preparing for the possibility that this situation could worsen. Then there is the third scenario, the one that many analysts consider the most complex: proxy escalation. Iran does not need to confront the United States directly to apply pressure. It has influence across multiple regions, groups that operate independently but align strategically. And when tension rises at the center, it often spreads outward. We've already seen early signs of this dynamic. In places like southern Lebanon, where groups like Hezbollah have been involved in renewed exchanges, the situation is becoming increasingly sensitive. These aren't full scale offensives, not yet, but they are signals that the conflict is not contained, signals that pressure in one area can trigger reactions in another. And that's what makes proxy escalation so dangerous. Because it expands the battlefield, it creates multiple points of tension, multiple flashpoints where something could go wrong. And once that happens, it becomes much harder to control the narrative, much harder to contain the conflict, because now it's no longer just about the United States and Iran, it's about the entire region. Another possibility, and one that cannot be ignored, is the collapse of diplomacy itself. Right now, talks are still technically on the table. Back channels are active, mediators are engaged, but diplomacy is not just about communication, it's about momentum, and momentum can disappear quickly. If Iran feels the blockade is tightening beyond what it considers acceptable, if the United States believes Iran is not engaging seriously, if another incident occurs that shifts public perception, then the space for negotiation could close. And once that space closes, it is extremely difficult to reopen because positions harden, expectations change, and the cost of compromise becomes higher. This is the tipping point that many are watching, not just whether talks succeed, but whether they survive at all. There's also a psychological element to all of this, one that often goes unnoticed. Both sides are sending messages, not just to each other, but to their own audiences. Strength matters, perception matters. Leaders cannot appear to be giving in under pressure, and that creates a kind of invisible pressure, one that pushes decisions in a certain direction, toward firmness, toward resistance, toward escalation, even when restraint might be the safer option. Because in geopolitical conflicts, internal perception can be just as important as external reality, and that makes compromise harder, especially in a situation where trust is already low. But perhaps the most critical risk of all is this: a chain reaction, one event leading to another, a naval incident triggering a response triggering retaliation, retaliation triggering a broader confrontation. And suddenly, what started as a controlled situation becomes something much larger, something much harder to stop. This is not speculation, it's a pattern that has played out many times before in history. Conflicts rarely begin with a single decision, they build layer by layer until one moment changes everything. Right now, all the ingredients for that kind of moment are present: military pressure, economic tension, regional instability, fragile diplomacy, and above all, uncertainty, because no one knows exactly how far the other side is willing to go. And that uncertainty creates risk, the kind of risk that keeps analysts watching every movement, every statement, every shift in tone. Because in a situation like this, the next move matters more than the last one. And the difference between stability and escalation could come down to a single decision, a single moment, a single miscalculation. In moments like this, the world often waits for a clear signal, something definitive that tells us whether a crisis is ending or just beginning. But this situation isn't offering clarity, it's offering contradictions. A ceasefire that doesn't reduce pressure, a pause that doesn't feel stable, a negotiation that doesn't look like compromise. And that's why the final outcome is still wide open, because what happens next will not be decided by a single announcement. It will be shaped by how these competing strategies collide. Right now, there are three realistic endgame scenarios emerging from this crisis. The first is controlled de escalation. This is the path where the ceasefire holds, not perfectly, not smoothly, but long enough for real negotiations to take shape. In this scenario, the blockade would eventually begin to ease, even if slowly. Restrictions would be adjusted, confidence building steps would be introduced. Back channel diplomacy would turn into formal agreements. But for this to happen, something critical must change: trust. And that is the hardest element to rebuild, because both sides would need to make concessions, not just in action, but in perception. The United States would need to signal that pressure has limits. Iran would need to show that engagement is possible without appearing to surrender. And mediators, particularly countries like Pakistan, would have to maintain momentum in a situation where even small setbacks could derail progress. This is the most stable outcome, but it is also the most difficult to achieve because it requires restraint at a time when pressure is still increasing. The second scenario is prolonged tension, no major breakthrough, no full collapse, just an extended period where the ceasefire technically exists, but the conflict continues in other forms. The blockade remains in place, naval patrols continue. Incidents occur, but are contained. This creates a kind of new normal, a situation where the world adapts to ongoing tension. Markets fluctuate but stabilize. Shipping routes adjust. Diplomacy continues but without urgency. At first, this might seem manageable, but over time, it creates its own risks. Because prolonged tension wears down stability, it increases the chances of miscalculation, it creates fatigue in diplomacy, and eventually, something breaks. A system like this is not designed to last forever. It either resolves or escalates, which brings us to the third and most dangerous scenario. Sudden escalation, not gradual, not predictable, but immediate, triggered by an event that shifts the entire dynamic. It could be a naval incident, a direct confrontation, a strike, intentional or accidental. And once that line is crossed, the logic of restraint disappears because both sides are then forced to respond, not just strategically, but visibly, forcefully, in a way that demonstrates control. And in that moment, the ceasefire becomes irrelevant because the situation moves into a different phase entirely, one where decisions are made faster, risks are higher, and consequences spread quickly. This is the scenario that global leaders are trying to avoid, but it is also the scenario that becomes more likely the longer pressure continues without resolution. And that brings us to the core reality of this entire situation. This is not just a conflict between two countries, it is a test of strategy, a test of patience, a test of limits, and perhaps most importantly, a test of timing, because timing determines everything. Act too early, and you risk escalation. Wait too long, and you lose control of the situation. And right now, both the United States and Iran are operating in that narrow space between action and restraint, trying to apply pressure without triggering collapse, trying to maintain control without losing it. But history shows that this balance is incredibly difficult to sustain because the more pressure builds, the harder it becomes to manage, and the smaller the margin for error becomes. One misstep, one moment of misjudgment, and everything changes. There's also a larger picture to consider, the global implications, because what happens here does not stay here. Energy markets are already reacting, trade routes are adjusting, allies are recalculating their positions. Countries like China and Russia are watching closely, not just as observers, but as players in a broader geopolitical game. Because every shift in this conflict creates opportunities, opportunities to expand influence, to challenge existing power structures, to reshape the balance of power. And that means the stakes are even higher than they appear. This is not just about a ceasefire, it's about what comes after it, what kind of world emerges from this moment. A world where pressure replaces cooperation, or a world where conflict forces a return to negotiation? That answer has not been decided yet, but the direction is being shaped right now in every decision, every movement, every signal sent across the region. And that's why this moment matters, because it's not stable, it's not resolved, it's not over, it's unfolding quietly, carefully, but with growing intensity. And as long as the blockade continues, as long as pressure remains, as long as trust is absent, the risk does not disappear, it builds. And the next phase of this crisis may not look like the last one. It may be faster, more direct, and far harder to contain, because sometimes the most dangerous moments in a conflict are the ones that look calm on the surface.